Well, certainly President Putin started with this long list of grievances, going back 30 years, mentioning NATO's action in Serbia back in the 90s, basically setting out his stall, as he's always said that he perceives NATO as a threat because despite what NATO says about it being a defensive organisation, he believes it's been used in an offensive way. Now, having set that out and sort of got that off his chest, and this is the most we've heard from him since the beginning of this crisis, and the last time he mentioned it in any length at all was back in December, then he wraps up his opening statements by saying, but it's wholly possible to form a basis for future progress based upon the talks we've had today. A very lengthy press conference with some very searching questions. At one point, Putin asked the journalist, do you want France to go to war with Russia? No, you don't. And then we had President Macron reiterating time after time that Europe needs to be at the centre of setting the new security concerns for Europe. Now, that really reflects a concern that's been increasingly evident recently that this has been a kind of a bilateral show between Russia, the US and NATO. And now what you have is Macron really firmly saying, and he must have agreed these points with President Biden because he talked with him on Sunday to have some kind of convergence on these issues. Macron is saying that this is a European issue. We have to work with our allies, but we have to guarantee security for all. And we can't have security in Europe if Russia and the Russian people don't have security, if they don't feel safe. So despite the fact that both presidents said that the road ahead was not easy, and they reiterated time after time that the way to resolve the Ukrainian crisis is already there. It's on the basis of the Minsk agreements that haven't really been observed at all. And there are a couple of key conditions which Putin mentioned when there was a question from a Russian journalist about the refusal by Kiev to engage with the separatist leaders from the Donbass region, from those two secessionist areas. And he said that there are a couple of points in the Minsk agreements that say that they have to talk with them. And Kiev has been refusing to do that, and that's one of the big sticking points. And the other issue, of course, which came up was that if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, the NATO and the US regard the Crimea, and the European Union, it must be said, regard the Crimea as part of Ukraine. President Putin said, well, it's part of Russia. We had elections, it's part of Russia. So what happens, that's his interpretation, but what happens if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO one day and they say, hang on, Russia's sitting on our territory? Then you face a war between Russia and NATO. Now, these are all valid points, and you may argue that the elections in Crimea were not carried out democratically, and that's a fact, actually. They weren't. However, if they had been, the result wouldn't have been any different.
Nick, one of the points you mentioned...
I was impressed. Yes.
Sorry, one of the points you mentioned was this role Emmanuel Macron has carved out for France, because one of the things he said was that a solution can be done diplomatically through the Normandy format, basically ensuring that France and Germany are at the table.
Absolutely. I mean, that's in addition to the Minsk agreements, the Normandy format. He even at some point mentioned, I don't know whether it was during this press conference at some point in the last day or so, whether America might be pulled into that as well. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the questions from one of the journalists in the press conference was whether Macron was trying to position himself as the new Angela Merkel, in the absence of, of the former German Chancellor, his trying to become some kind of face of Europe. He made the point that France is hold the presidency of the European Union during these 6 months, so therefore he is effectively the face of Europe during this period. However, it is really clear that he's carving out a European path in addition to working with European allies in America and within the NATO bloc. And he reiterated several times that this can't just be solved by using NATO, by using a military bloc. This has to be solved by countries in Europe, whether in the European Union or whether they're not. And he mentioned Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and of course he's in Russia, talking with the Russian president. This has to be a common European concern. And the fact that those talks went on for nearly 6 hours and the press conference went on for over an hour, and the press conference started 10 minutes past midnight in Moscow, finished just a few minutes past 1, I think that this does actually lay the basis, as Macron said, and as Putin also reiterated, this lays the basis for a diplomatic path and a de-escalation and a new look at security arrangements in Europe. Possibly, we may just have seen a small window of opportunity to pull back from all the tension and all the talk of war that we've heard so much of in the last few days and weeks.
Nick, given that Vladimir Putin, repeatedly thanked Emmanuel Macron for his efforts with the Normandy format talks, and he did say that the discussions today did form a basis for future progress, is diplomacy now being extended, considering that we do have Emmanuel Macron going to Kiev tomorrow, and he will report back to Vladimir Putin, and then next week itself we have the German Chancellor who's going to be doing the same thing, the shuttle diplomacy essentially continuing?
It does very much seem to be in that way. There was an interesting point. At one point in one of the lengthy answers given, and I was trying to sort of tap in as we went along, I was trying to sort of touch type it. But at one point, Macron referred to the fact that if Europe didn't work with Russia, others may step into the void. And he didn't mention any country. But where was Vladimir Putin last Friday? In Beijing at the opening of the Beijing Olympics. And of course, part of this whole issue in the last few weeks is the way that Russia has begun to pivot towards China. And I think that's a real concern in the West, that China could start making ground in an area which is traditionally a European area. And Macron reiterated several times, Russia is part of Europe. This is the European continent. This is a European issue. It's up to us Europeans to resolve these conflicts of interest. And he referred to the trauma of the past. And it was kind of like, I was impressed by the degree to which certainly Macron exhibited in emotional intelligence here. A bit difficult to apply that term to Vladimir Putin, but still he went along with this. And I think we do see some room here, and certainly you've just mentioned those Normandy format talks is a core approach that Europe can use to build what Macron has laid out along with President Putin tonight in Moscow.
Nick, thank you very much for that. Nick Holdsworth reporting there